For days, the message from Washington was simple. The war was under control. U.S. strikes were hitting deeper inside Iran, military targets were being destroyed, and the campaign was being presented as disciplined, focused, and on track. But then came the kind of incident that can change the mood of an entire war in a single afternoon. A U.S. F-35, one of the most advanced stealth fighters in the world, returned from a combat mission over Iran and was forced into an emergency landing. The pilot survived. The aircraft did not simply complete its mission and disappear back into the sky. It came back as a question mark. And that is why this moment matters. Because once a stealth jet ends up in an emergency landing story, the narrative shifts immediately. This stops being only a story about how much pressure Washington can apply. It becomes a story about how much danger still exists in the battle space, how much Iran can still impose cost, and how fragile the image of total control really is. That is the deeper meaning here. Not that one aircraft decides the war, but that one incident can expose the gap between public confidence and battlefield reality. And once that gap becomes visible, everything else in the conflict starts looking different. The F-35 is not just another aircraft in the American arsenal. It is a symbol. It represents stealth, precision, technological superiority, and the ability to operate in the most contested airspace on Earth. So when that symbol is attached to an emergency landing after a mission over Iran, the implications move far beyond the runway. Iranian media quickly claimed that its air defenses had struck the jet and seriously damaged it. Whether every detail of that claim is ultimately confirmed is not the immediate point. The point is that Iran instantly recognized the political value of this event. It saw a chance to challenge the core assumption behind the U.S. campaign, that American air power can move over Iran with overwhelming control. And that matters because perception is part of warfare. Tehran does not need to prove it can dominate the sky. It only needs to show that the sky is still dangerous, that American missions still carry risk, and that the United States is not operating inside a frictionless battle space. That alone changes the tone of the war. Because once the most advanced aircraft in the fight appears vulnerable, even temporarily, the public starts asking a different question. Not, how many targets are being hit, but how high is the cost of hitting them? And this is where the story gets heavier. The F-35 incident did not happen in a vacuum. It landed in a war that has already killed American service members and wounded many more. That changes everything about how the public reads new developments like this one. If the campaign had remained bloodless from the U.S. side, Washington would have had more room to present every setback as limited or manageable. But that is no longer the environment. There is already a casualty ledger. There are already funerals, wounded troops, and growing questions about how long a widening regional war can remain politically sustainable. That means every new military shock carries more weight than it otherwise would. And that is the real pressure point now. The administration wants to frame the war as disciplined and effective. But once losses begin to accumulate, effectiveness is no longer the only test. Credibility becomes the test. Can the leadership still persuade the public that the mission is under control when troops are dying, aircraft are being damaged, and the battlefield keeps producing fresh surprises? Because once doubt enters that equation, even operational success starts to feel less stable. It starts to look like momentum without certainty, and that is a dangerous place for any administration to be in the middle of a fast-moving conflict. On one level, Washington's argument still sounds strong. U.S. officials say they have struck thousands of targets inside Iran. They say operations are going deeper into Iranian territory. They insist the objectives remain unchanged, on target and on plan. But that is exactly where the contradiction begins. Because even while projecting confidence, U.S. officials have also acknowledged that Iran still retains missile capability. That matters more than any slogan from a press conference. It means the enemy has not been emptied of its capacity to retaliate. It means Iran can still threaten U.S. assets, regional partners, energy infrastructure, and the broader psychological image of control that Washington is trying to maintain. So now the war contains two competing realities at the same time. One reality says the United States is inflicting major damage and dictating the tempo. The other says Iran still has enough capacity left to create costly, politically sensitive moments, like damaged aircraft, missile threats, and market shocks. That gap is where wars become dangerous, because once leaders sound more certain than the battlefield actually is, every surprise becomes more damaging. Every new incident feels like evidence that the campaign is less contained than it was sold to be. And that may be the biggest significance of the F-35 story. Not that U.S. power is collapsing, but that the illusion of easy control is becoming harder to sustain. Now step back and look at the wider map. This war is no longer just about isolated strike missions. U.S. officials are openly discussing options connected to the Strait of Hormuz, safe passage for tankers, and additional regional military steps. Karg Island, the hub for most of Iran's oil exports, has also entered the strategic conversation. That tells you this conflict is moving beyond a simple air campaign. And this is why that matters. Once a war starts touching shipping lanes, export hubs, and energy choke points, it stops being a narrow military operation. It becomes a broader geopolitical and economic confrontation. More actors become exposed, more triggers emerge, and the chances of controlled escalation start shrinking. The logic is brutal but simple. If Iran can still threaten regional stability or energy flows, Washington has more reason to widen its mission. But if Washington widens its mission, Tehran has more reason to retaliate in ways that hit markets, allies, and global confidence. That creates a cycle where each side can justify its next move as necessary, even as the overall conflict becomes more dangerous. And once that cycle starts, tactical incidents do not stay tactical for long. They become arguments for a bigger war. This is the point where the war stops being only a military story and becomes an economic one. Reuters reports that attacks on energy infrastructure marked a major escalation and pushed gasoline and oil prices higher. That should not be treated as a side issue. It is central to understanding the stakes. Because the moment energy routes and export infrastructure come under pressure, the cost of conflict spreads far beyond the battlefield. It reaches households through fuel prices. It reaches businesses through transport costs. It reaches governments through inflation risk, supply fears, insurance pressure, and market volatility. In other words, once the war starts pressing on energy systems, ordinary people far from Iran begin to feel the consequences. That is why Hormuz is so important. It is not just a strategic waterway on a map. It is one of the world's most sensitive economic pressure points. If this war keeps moving in that direction, then every fresh exchange carries the risk of a bigger international shock. And that is where the pressure starts to widen. Because now the war is not only about defeating targets or restoring deterrence, it is about whether the United States can pursue military objectives without helping trigger a broader energy and inflation crisis that damages its own position at home and abroad. So what does all this add up to? It adds up to a trap. Trump wants to project strength, control, and momentum. He does not want this war to look like a conflict that is widening under pressure from battlefield events. But the more incidents like the F-35 emergency landing appear, the harder that political balancing act becomes. If the administration downplays the incident, it risks looking disconnected from reality. If it reacts too aggressively, it risks confirming that Iran still has the ability to shape U.S. decisions through pressure and attrition. If it expands the conflict, it inherits higher costs and greater exposure. If it hesitates, critics will argue that deterrence has been weakened. And all of this is unfolding while the Pentagon is seeking enormous additional war funding. That alone signals that this may not remain a short, clean, limited campaign. The bigger the cost, the harder it becomes to keep selling the war as disciplined and contained. So the F-35 story matters not because it proves the United States is losing. It matters because it proves the conflict is becoming harder to define, harder to cap, and harder to narrate as a simple success story. And once a war reaches that stage, the danger is no longer just what happens in the skies over Iran. The danger is that the war becomes structurally bigger than the message surrounding it. Right now, that looks like the real turning point.